Walter thought silence would be his only medicine. 34 years of marriage, and now nothing left but emptiness. After burying the love of his life, he decided he never wanted to be seen by anyone again. He sold the house, walked away from his friends, and drove to the most isolated place he could find on the map. He went to the mountains to wait for the end. But what Walter didn't know was that hidden in the attic of that old farmhouse was a box that had been locked for 42 years, and carved into the lid, in letters cut by a pocket knife, was a name that would make a heart he swore was dead stop cold in his chest. Get your heart ready, because sometimes when we think we've reached the end of everything, that's exactly where life has hidden our greatest miracle. The truck stopped at the end of Red Clay Road, because there was nowhere left to go. Walter Hayes killed the engine and just sat there, hands still on the wheel, staring at the old farmhouse he'd bought without ever laying eyes on it. Crooked roof, peeling paint, a wraparound porch that seemed to breathe with the wind. At 60 years old, he'd built commercial towers across Charlotte, closed deals worth millions, shaken hands with men whose names ran in the business section, and now here he was, in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, standing in front of a house that looked exactly like the exhaustion of his own soul, built out of lumber and nails. On the passenger seat sat a single suitcase, and inside it, almost nothing the world would call valuable. A change of clothes, a pair of boots, a photograph of Caroline laughing on a beach, and her wedding ring, which he'd slid off her finger in the hospital with shaking hands, and now carried in his shirt pocket, like a man carrying a shard of glass against his heart. Every dollar he had left sat untouched in accounts he had no intention of ever opening again. What he wanted, no fortune on earth could buy back. Caroline had passed on a Tuesday morning, 5 months earlier, after more than a year fighting an illness that ate away first at her body and then at his hope. 34 years of marriage, 34 years of coffee on the porch, silly arguments about dinner, hands held in dark movie theaters, a closeness so old they'd stopped needing to finish each other's sentences. When she was gone, Walter discovered he'd forgotten how to live alone. Worse, he discovered he didn't want to learn. He climbed out of the truck slower than a man 10 years older. The air up here was different, sweet wood smoke drifting from some far-off chimney, mixed with wet earth and the green smell of the orchards climbing the hillsides below. Down in the little valley, he could make out tin roofs, a white church steeple, and rows of apple trees marching up the slopes like a green army. It was beautiful. Walter noticed it was beautiful the way you notice the sky is blue while you're drowning, with indifference. If this story feels far away from you right now, sitting in some little valley town most maps don't bother to name, stay with me, because it might be closer to home than you think. Walter let himself in with the huge rusted key the realtor had left under a cracked flower pot. The hinges groaned. Inside, the house smelled of mildew and stopped time. The few pieces of furniture that came with the sale sat under white sheets, and when the afternoon light poured through the open door, it stirred up a cloud of dust that danced in the air, as if the whole house were finally exhaling after years of holding its breath. He dropped his suitcase in the middle of the living room and stood there, not knowing what to do with his own hands. It had been like that since the funeral. His hands, which for decades had known exactly what to do, Neekum sign, shake, steer, wrap around Caroline's waist, now hung off his arms like two strange objects he didn't recognize. Widower's hands. Hands that had held hers until her very last breath, and now had nothing left to hold. That first night, Walter couldn't sleep. He laid an old mattress on the bedroom floor because the bed frame creaked, and the sound frightened him in the dark, and he lay there staring at the ceiling, where an old water stain had drawn a faded yellow map. Outside, the crickets sang a deafening chorus, so different from the padded silence of his old high-rise apartment. He'd come chasing quiet, but he learned the countryside isn't quiet at all. The countryside is full of life, frogs, owls, wind through the orchard leaves, a dog barking somewhere far off. And all that life pulsing around him only made the emptiness in his chest feel bigger. He took Caroline's ring from the coat pocket, folded beside the mattress, and pressed it against his face. It still smelled like her, or he told himself it did. For a second, he was back in that grey morning at the cemetery 5 months earlier. Damp earth, the casket lowering, friends in suits he never wanted to see again, and him standing there gripping that ring so hard the metal left a mark on his palm. That had been the last time Walter let anyone see him up close. "I came here to wait for you," he whispered into the dark, as if she could hear him. "I don't know how long it'll take, but I promise I won't bother anybody else with my grief." And for the first time in 5 months, Walter cried without holding back, his whole body shaking on the floor of that empty house, at the end of a dirt road, at the end of everything he thought his life could ever be. But fate, patient as soil waiting on rain, was already moving. He just didn't know it yet. Morning arrived without asking permission, pouring gold light through the bare window. Walter woke stiff from the hard floor, caught in that half-second of confusion every grieving person knows, the instant you reach across the mattress expecting the warmth of the person you love, before memory hits like a fist to the gut. Caroline wasn't there. Caroline would never be there again. He swallowed that down the way he swallowed it every single morning, and got up. The first thing he tried to make was coffee. Back home it had always been Caroline's job. She had a trick, a pinch of cinnamon stirred into the water, said it was her grandmother's secret, and the coffee came out smelling so good it filled the whole apartment and put Walter in a good mood even on the heaviest work days. He found an old percolator in the kitchen, a forgotten bag of grounds in the pantry, and tried to repeat the ritual, but his clumsy hands sloshed hot water across the counter. The coffee came out weak and bitter, and when he tasted it he made a face and poured the whole pot down the drain. He sat in the one chair left in the kitchen and held his forehead in his hands. He couldn't even make coffee anymore. It went on like that for days. Walter became a ghost in his own house. He never really unpacked, wore the same clothes, ate whatever he found in the cans he'd bought at the general store, crackers, tuna, peach preserves. In the afternoons he sat on the porch staring at nothing, his beard growing in, his grey hair a mess. From a distance he watched the little valley town go about its life, women talking over fences, men coming back from the orchards with pruning shears over their shoulders, kids chasing a football down the road, old Hank Dooley making his rounds in a rusted pickup that everybody in town called Old Betsy. It was a small community where everybody knew everybody, where front doors stayed unlocked, and a neighbor just walked in without knocking. Everything Walter had come here to escape. One morning, Ruth Ann Coleman, who lived in the first house at the edge of town, came up the road carrying a covered dish. She knocked at the porch railing, in that old mountain habit of announcing yourself instead of walking straight up to the door. Walter, sitting on the porch, seriously considered pretending he wasn't home, but Ruth Ann had already spotted him, and that would have been rude even for a man who'd decided to disappear from the world. He got up and went to the gate, face closed off. "Morning, sugar," she said, smiling, holding the dish out. "Brought you some chicken and dumplings. Saw you moved in all by yourself and thought, poor thing, probably not eating right. Round here we look out for each other." Walter took the dish with a mumbled thanks, cold, almost rude. Ruth Ann didn't flinch. "Anything you need, you just holler. My place is the blue one by the oak tree." And she walked off down the road with the ease of a woman who'd done exactly what needed doing. Walter stood there holding the dish, the warmth of the food seeping through the porcelain into his fingers. That small, unasked-for gesture from a woman he didn't even know stirred something in him he'd rather have kept asleep. He went inside, set the dish on the table, and didn't eat right away. But that night, hungry, with nothing left but crackers, he tried it. And it was good. Too good. It tasted like care, like food made by hands that wanted good things for whoever ate it. Walter finished every bite in silence, and when he was done, he realized it was the first real meal he'd had since Caroline died. The realization left him strangely uneasy, as if he'd betrayed his own grief by finding pleasure in something as simple as a plate of chicken and dumplings. It was on a drizzly afternoon, the kind that soaks you worse than a downpour, that Walter finally climbed up to the attic. He was hunting for a candle, because the power had gone out and the whole hollow had gone dark. The wooden stairs groaned under his feet. Up there, the air hung thick with dust and things forgotten by the previous owner, a man named Earl Whitman, who'd died with children who sold the place from a distance, never once coming to see it. Boxes, broken furniture, an old sewing machine draped in cobwebs, portraits of strangers staring out of the past with that stiff formality of old photographs. And then he saw it. up on a high shelf, set apart from everything else, as if someone had hidden it on purpose. A dark wooden box, about the size of a shoebox, with metal corners and a small rusted padlock. Walter reached it with some effort and brought it close to the candlelight. He blew off the dust, and his heart, the heart he'd sworn was dead, leapt inside his chest, because there, carved into the lid in rough letters cut with a pocket knife, was a name he knew better than his own. A name he'd whispered thousands of times over 34 years. A name he'd seen carved into a headstone 5 months earlier. Caroline. Walter froze, the candle trembling in his hand, throwing dancing shadows across the attic walls. How? How could his wife's name, a woman buried 300 miles away, be carved into a box forgotten in the attic of an old farmhouse in the mountains, bought almost by accident from a man he'd never met? It didn't make sense. It couldn't be the same Caroline. Caroline was a common enough name. This had to be one of those coincidences life plays on the living just to confuse them. But his hands, the hands that had forgotten what to do, now trembled with an urgency he hadn't felt in months. He tried the padlock. Locked. He shook the box gently and heard something shift inside. Papers sliding, maybe letters, maybe secrets. That night, Walter didn't sleep again, but for a different reason. For the first time since Caroline's death, it wasn't grief keeping him awake. It was something he'd nearly forgotten existed. Curiosity, a question lodged in his chest like a splinter. He turned the box over in his hands all night, examined every corner, tried to force the lock with a kitchen knife and failed. By morning, exhausted and unshaven, he'd made a decision that would have seemed impossible days earlier. He needed to know. And to find out, he'd have to do the one thing he'd sworn never to do again, walk out of his cocoon of grief and knock on a stranger's door. Dooley's General Store was the heartbeat of the whole hollow. News traveled faster there than by mail. Men played checkers on the porch at dusk. Women bought flour and traded gossip. Walter walked in awkwardly, the box tucked under his arm, and every eye turned to him with that respectful mountain curiosity. Hank Dooley, a heavy-set man in a stained apron, greeted him with exaggerated warmth. "Well, if it isn't the fellow who bought old Earl Whitman's place. We were wondering when you'd finally come down and say hello." Walter forced a smile that came out more like a grimace, showed the box, asked if anyone knew whose it might be, pointed to the name carved on the lid. The men exchanged looks. Hank scratched his head. Caroline. Well now, there was a Caroline used to live around here long time back, just a girl. Best friends with Dorothy Callahan up at the farm. Those two were thick as thieves. But Caroline moved off to the city with her folks. Must have been 17, 18 years old. Never came back. That's got to be 42 years now. Walter felt the floor tilt under him. Caroline had told him once, vaguely, that she'd spent her childhood in some little mountain town before her family moved away. But she'd almost never talked about that time. Said it hurt too much to remember things she'd lost. He'd never asked the name of the place. Never imagined. And now, by some twist of fate too enormous to be coincidence, he was standing on the very ground where his Caroline had once been a girl. He had bought, without knowing it, a house a few hundred yards from where she'd played, laughed, dreamed. "This Dorothy," he asked, voice cracking, "does she still live around here?" Hank pointed toward the mountains. "Sure does. Sweetwater Farm, top of that hollow road. But you best get on up there. Dot's the type to be up with the roosters and asleep with the chickens. And take that box. If it's got Caroline's name on it, she's the one you need to talk to." Sweetwater Farm was exactly what its name promised. Walter drove up the gravel road between two walls of apple trees heavy with green and red fruit, the sweet smell filling the air, and when he reached the top he found a simple, well-kept farmhouse, whitewashed hanging ferns on the porch, and a swept dirt yard where crates of freshly picked apples sat drying in the sun. Chickens scratched in the dirt. A mutt lifted its head and thumped its tail without bothering to bark. And there, kneeling in a garden bed with a straw hat and dirt on her hands, was a woman. She stood when she saw him, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked about his age, grey hair pinned up in a loose bun, sun-worn skin creased at the corners of her eyes from a lifetime of smiling. But what caught Walter wasn't any of that. It was her eyes, a peace so deep, so settled, that it unsettled him instantly. How could anyone carry that kind of calm? He who carried the whole world caved in on his shoulders felt something close to anger at that stillness. "Help you?" she said, voice easy. "You're the fella who bought the old Whitman place, aren't you? News travels fast around here." Walter didn't know what to say. He simply held out the box, in silence, the carved name turned toward her. Dorothy looked at the box, and Walter watched, in real time, the piece on that face come undone. Her eyes went wide, her hand flew to her mouth, and 2 tears slid down without her making any effort to stop them. She took the box with both hands, the way you'd cradle a baby, and held it to her chest. "Lord have mercy," she whispered. "Lord, I thought this was gone for good." She looked up at Walter, eyes wet, a question trembling on her lips. Where did you find this? How do you know about Caroline?" And it was Walter's turn to feel his throat close. It had been 5 months since he'd said that name out loud, without it cutting like a blade. But he said it. "Caroline," he answered, voice rough, broken. "Caroline was my wife. She died 5 months ago." The yard went quiet, only the wind moving through the apple leaves. 2 souls standing there bound by a single name, discovering in the same instant that they'd both been grieving the same woman. Dorothy led Walter inside without another word, just a gesture of the hand. The way you welcome someone who's out of strength to be a guest. The kitchen was small and warm, a wood stove humming in the corner, the smell of coffee always seeming to hang in that house. She sat him at the table, set a mug in front of him, and cut a thick slice of apple stack cake sitting under a checkered cloth. "Drink up," she said. "You look like a man who hasn't eaten right in a good while." And Walter, who'd turned away half the food in the world these last months, didn't turn this away. He drank the coffee, and it was exactly like Caroline's. Cinnamon. The mug nearly slipped from his fingers. "The cinnamon. Caroline and I learned that together," Dorothy said softly, catching his reaction, sitting across from him with the box still in her lap. "Her grandmother's secret. She taught me, and I never made coffee any other way since." Walter couldn't hold it back. 34 years thinking that cinnamon was a little secret just between him and Caroline, an intimacy of their marriage, and now finding out it was the inheritance of a childhood friendship he never even knew existed. The tears came, and this time he wasn't ashamed. Dorothy didn't say don't cry, didn't try to comfort him with empty phrases. She just reached across the table and laid her hand over his, calloused and warm, and let him cry as long as he needed. The silence between them said what words couldn't. When he'd calmed down, Dorothy pulled a small key on a cord out from inside her own dress, and Walter realized, stunned, that she'd worn that key against her heart for 42 years. "I made a copy of the key to that box before Caroline moved away," she explained, voice thick. "We promised each other that one day we'd open it together, that she'd come visit, and we'd read it all again, old women, laughing at our own foolishness. Life had other plans." She turned the key in the rusted lock. It clicked. The lid creaked open, and inside, yellowed with age, tied with a faded ribbon, were dozens of letters. The round, careful handwriting of 2 girls who wrote to each other and buried everything in a box in the backyard like buried treasure. Dorothy lifted the first letter with trembling fingers and began reading aloud. It was Caroline at 12 years old, telling her friend about a dress her mother was sewing for the county fair, about the boy at the store she liked in secret, about being scared to move away. And Walter, hearing that childlike voice leap off the page after 42 years, met a Caroline he'd never known. The girl Caroline, the Caroline before him, the Caroline who dreamed, who feared, who laughed at her own mischief. Letter after letter, Dorothy handed him pieces of the woman he loved and thought he knew whole. But nobody knows another person whole. There's always a piece left tucked away, in a box, in an attic, in the heart of a childhood friend, at the end of a dirt road. In one letter, Caroline described the day she and Dorothy hiked up into the mountains, chasing a hidden waterfall the old-timers swore existed. They'd walked for hours, gotten lost, cried from fear thinking they'd have to sleep in the woods, and just when they were about to give up, found water pouring off a high rock into a pool so deep and green it looked bottomless. "We swore that was our secret place, Dorothy," the letter read, "that someday, old women, we'd go back there together." Walter heard that, and something sparked in his memory. Caroline, already sick in the hospital, had murmured something between fevers he hadn't understood at the time. The waterfall, Dorothy. He'd thought it was just delirium. Now he knew it was longing, that in her final days, his wife's mind had gone back to that green water in the mountains, to the friend she never got to hold again. Dorothy, reading his expression, stopped. "You all right?" Walter shook his head, unable to speak for a moment. Then he told her about the hospital, about the delirium that wasn't delirium, about Caroline's last words that only now made any sense, and the two of them, sitting in that warm kitchen by the wood stove, cried together for the same woman who had loved them both, and in the end had wanted to go back to where it all began. "She never forgot you," Walter told Dorothy, voice breaking. "At the very end, it was you and that waterfall she was calling for." And Dorothy, who'd carried 42 years of guilt for never visiting her friend in time, felt that weight loosen a little, like dry ground finally getting rain. "She talked about you all the time," Dorothy said in a pause between letters. Walter lifted his head, startled. "What do you mean? She didn't know I existed in those letters. She's a little girl in them." Dorothy smiled through her tears. "Not in these. But we found each other again, you know, about 7 years back. Caroline tracked me down, sent a letter to this hollow asking if her old friend still lived here. We started writing again, kept it secret, even from you, because she wanted it to be a surprise. She was planning to bring you here. She used to say, 'Dot, my Walter works himself to death, surrounded by people who just want his money. He's forgotten what it means to be happy with less. I'm going to bring him up to the mountains and show him where I come from.'" Dorothy paused, voice breaking. "She bought the old Whitman place, Walter. It was her. Paid for it, set it aside, without you ever knowing. It was supposed to be a surprise for the two of you. Then she got sick." Walter couldn't breathe. "The old house at the end of the road, the one he'd found by accident on some cut-rate real estate listing, bought on the impulse of a man who wanted to vanish, was Caroline's house. The house she'd bought for him, for the two of them, so he could learn beside her how to live slower, drink coffee on the porch, be happy with less. He'd run to the end of the world thinking he was escaping everything, and fate or Caroline or God or all three together had led him to the one place on earth where she was still waiting for him. Not in a grave, in a house, in a box, in the hands of a friend. "She didn't leave you alone, Walter," Dorothy said, unknowingly repeating the exact words he needed to hear most. "She brought you here. She knew you could start over." Walter left Sweetwater Farm at dusk, his whole soul turned inside out. He walked down the gravel road with Caroline's box under his arm, Dorothy having insisted he take it, since these letters are half hers and half your Caroline's, and hers now belongs to you. That night he read all of them, the ones from the last 7 years too, the letters 2 grown women had traded in secret. And in nearly every one there he was. Walter dreamed about, planned for, loved by a wife who'd been quietly building him a better life behind the scenes, never asking for a thing in return. He cried again, but it was a different kind of crying. Not the crying of loss, the crying of a man discovering, late but not too late, the size of the love he'd been given. The next morning, for the first time in 5 months, Walter did something he hadn't done. He threw open every window in the house, let the sun in, let the air move, pulled the sheets off the furniture, found an old recipe box in a kitchen drawer that must have belonged to some woman who'd lived there before, and had an idea. He walked to the general store, bought coffee grounds and cinnamon, and came home determined to make that coffee right. Caroline's way. Dorothy's way. He spilled half the water again, but this time, instead of dumping it out and giving up, he laughed at himself. A short, rusty laugh that startled even him. But it was a laugh. He made the coffee again, and this time it came out right. A new routine began, tentative but alive. Almost every afternoon, Walter walked up to Sweetwater Farm. He told himself it was for the stories about Caroline, and in part, that was true. Dorothy had a bottomless trunk of memories. The time she and Caroline skipped school to swim at the falls, the county fair dance where Caroline danced 2 partners at once, the jam they stole from the pantry and ate until they were sick. And Walter laughed. Little by little he laughed more, but he began to notice, with a mix of guilt and relief, that he wasn't climbing that hill just for Caroline's stories anymore. He was going for Dorothy too, for her calm, for the way she talked to her plants, cared for her animals, welcomed anyone who wandered into her yard with coffee and cake. Dorothy had been widowed more than 10 years, raised 2 kids who now lived far away, and had learned in the silence of these mountains the very thing Walter had come here desperately searching for: how to be happy even in the middle of losing everything. "How do you do it?" he asked her one afternoon, sitting on her porch as the sun went down orange behind the ridgeline. "You lost your husband. Your kids moved away. You live out here alone in the middle of nowhere. How aren't you—" "How you were," Dorothy finished, taking a sip of coffee before answering. "I was, you know. Stayed a long time feeling exactly the way you did when you first drove up here, thinking life was over. But one day I figured something out." She nodded toward the orchard covering the hillside. "Look at those trees. Every fall I think, that's it. This is the last harvest, the ground's given all it's got. And every single spring after the first warm rain, they bloom all over again. White, sweet-smelling. The whole hill covered like it's snowing in July. The land doesn't know how to quit, Walter. It just rests and starts over. I decided to learn from the land." Walter sat in silence, staring at that green sea, and felt for the first time since Caroline died a longing that had died with her, the longing to see the next bloom. The change in him was plain to anyone paying attention. Ruth Ann, still climbing the road with covered dishes, mentioned to the other women at the store that the fella at the old Whitman place had softened up, that he actually said good morning now, had even trimmed his beard. Hank noticed Walter trading a dozen words at the counter, even chancing a laugh with the men. And there was Tommy, Ruth Ann's grandson, a boy of about 10 who'd lost his father in a tractor accident and had lived quieter than any child should. Tommy had started climbing up to Walter's place to look at the old car magazines the city man had brought in his suitcase. Walter, who'd never had patience for a child's noise, found he had patience for Tommy. More than that, he found himself waiting for him. The quiet boy and the broken man made an unlikely pair, flipping through magazines together on the porch in comfortable silence. But the hope growing in Walter still shared space with fear. At night, alone, the guilt crept in. What right did he have to laugh, to want to see the bloom, to feel his heart warm around Dorothy? If Caroline was cold in the ground, wasn't that betrayal? Wasn't that forgetting? One of those nights he picked up her ring, still kept close, and stared at the small gold circle. "Forgive me," he asked the silence. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore. I came here to wait for you, and I'm learning how to live. Is that all right? Give me a sign, Caroline. Tell me I can." But the answer didn't come that night. The answer, like everything in life, would come in the most unexpected way, in the middle of a storm. It announced itself at the end of a heavy, muggy afternoon, the kind where the air turns thick and the birds go quiet ahead of time. The sky, blue and clear all morning, darkened into a wall of lead-colored clouds rolling down off the mountains like an advancing army. The old-timers in town squinted at the horizon and said this one was bringing something big, hail most likely. And hail this close to apple harvest was the worst thing that could happen to a grower. Walter was on the porch when the first thunder rolled, and his first thought, before anything else, was Dorothy. Dorothy's harvest. Everything she had sat in those crates of freshly picked apples drying in the open yard, and on the trees still heavy with fruit on the exposed hillside. He didn't think twice, grabbed his truck keys and drove up the gravel road, which was already turning to mud under sheets of rain. He found Dorothy alone in the yard, fighting desperately with a tarp, trying to cover crates of apples the rain threatened to ruin. A whole season's work about to spoil or wash down the hill. She was soaked through, her hat plastered to her head, fighting the wind with whatever strength she had left, which wasn't much for a woman pushing 60. "Dorothy," he shouted, jumping out of the truck into the downpour. "Get inside. You're going to hurt yourself." She turned, face streaming with rain and something more. "I can't, Walter. This is everything I've got. If I lose this crop, I lose the farm. I lose my kids' inheritance. I lose everything." And right there, in that instant, soaked under water, pouring down like the whole sky was collapsing, the miracle nobody saw happened. The man who'd crossed the country to die in silence, the man who'd stopped seeing color in the world, the man waiting for his own end. That man grabbed a tarp corner and started fighting. He fought for someone else's harvest, like he'd never fought for a single one of his $1 million deals. He pushed crates, hauled tarps, slipped in the mud, fell, got back up and kept going. The rain punished them. The wind ripped the tarps from their hands. Thunder cracked so close it shook the ground. And Walter, who wanted to die, discovered in that storm that he was fiercely, desperately alive. Because only the living fight with everything they have to save what they love. And he was fighting to save Dorothy. At one point in the struggle, a tarp tore loose and sailed across the yard like a sail ripped from a ship. Dorothy ran after it and slipped in the mud, going down hard near the porch steps. For a second, Walter's heart stopped. The same terror he'd felt in the hospital when Caroline's monitors started screaming. He dropped everything and ran to her, knelt in the mud, took her face in his hands. "You all right, Dorothy? Talk to me." She was fine, just shaken, a shallow scrape on her knee. But in that second of pure dread, Walter discovered something he'd been afraid to find. He couldn't bear to lose another person, and that could only mean one thing. He'd started caring about someone enough to fear losing them again. The fear he'd thought was weakness was, in fact, proof his heart had started working again. He helped her up, and the two of them, side by side now, moving like they'd done this together their whole lives, hauled the tarp back, saved what crates they could, rigged a makeshift barrier of boards and feed sacks to divert the runoff pouring down the hill. The fight lasted hours. When the hail finally came, small and thankfully sparse, they'd already gotten most of the crop under cover, and the bulk of the orchard on the slope was spared the worst of it by luck and the direction of the wind. Exhausted, soaked to the bone, the two of them took shelter on the porch, breathless, shivering. Dorothy looked at that city man, at those soft hands built for pens and keyboards, now scraped and caked with mud, and started laughing. A half-hysterical laugh, the kind that comes after surviving a scare, which turned into crying, which turned back into laughing. And Walter laughed with her, the two of them there on the porch, laughing and crying under a storm that was moving on. Two survivors life had thrown at each other by the crookedest road imaginable. It was there, still catching their breath, the rain easing, the smell of wet earth rising thick off the ground, that Dorothy said the thing Walter had needed to hear since the day he buried Caroline. She took his scraped hand between hers and spoke low, looking him in the eye. "Walter, love doesn't die. It just changes shape. Caroline didn't leave you. She just changed form. She became this hollow. She became this house. She became these stories. She became this cinnamon coffee. She brought you all the way out here not to wait for death. She brought you here to remember how to live, and if your heart's beating hard again today, that's not betrayal. No, that's Caroline smiling, knowing she did the last thing she wanted on this earth, to see you happy again." Walter cried, but it was the last time he'd cry that way, because he finally understood. The sign he'd asked Caroline for had already come, and the sign was this whole place. It was Dorothy. The months that followed changed the whole hollow, though nobody could quite explain why. Good things started happening, quiet, as if somebody were working behind the scenes. The little county school, about to close for lack of funding, with a leaking roof, got a full repair, and a brand new library full of books that still smelled of fresh ink, and nobody ever figured out who paid for it. The growers' co-op, which had always sold its fruit dirt cheap to sharp-dealing middlemen, got a visit one day from a soft-spoken man who understood business like nobody's business, and who, without charging a dime, taught them how to organize, how to negotiate, how to sell straight to buyers outside the hollow for a fair price. Old Hank Dooley, going blind from cataracts with no money for the surgery, got a bus ticket, a doctor's appointment, and an operation paid for by an anonymous donor, and came home seeing his grandkids clearly for the first time in years. It was Walter, of course, but Walter did it all in silence, no name attached, no plaque, nobody ever knowing that the quiet man at the end of the road was the same man who'd once moved millions in the city. He discovered that money, which had never once brought him happiness when hoarded, took on a different flavor when spent quietly for other people's good. It wasn't rich man charity looking for attention. It was the kind of care he'd learned from a wife who bought houses in secret, and a friend who kept a key against her heart for 42 years. The lesson that the most beautiful gestures are the ones nobody sees. And the boy, Tommy, the quiet boy, started talking more. Walter, who'd been a hard-nosed businessman and never had children of his own, found a patience in himself he never knew he had. He taught the boy to read a clock, to do his arithmetic, to sketch the cars from the magazines, took him fishing down at the creek, and one afternoon Tommy, who never talked about his dead father, looked at Walter out of nowhere and asked, with the terrifying honesty only children have, "Mister, Walter, did you lose somebody too?" And Walter, who'd never managed to talk about Caroline with a single grown adult without breaking down, found he could talk to that boy. He told him about her, about the cinnamon coffee, about the house she'd bought in secret. And Tommy listened seriously, then said, "So she's like my dad. She's someplace we can't see, but she's still watching out for us." Walter had to turn his face away so the boy wouldn't catch the tears. Kids understand in a heartbeat what the rest of us spend a lifetime trying to figure out. It all came together at the town's 4th of July celebration. The whole hollow gathered on the courthouse lawn, red, white and blue bunting strung between the trees, a bonfire crackling, the smell of barbecue and cornbread and peach cobbler filling the warm night air. A fiddle band struck up, couples formed up for a square dance, and Ruth Ann, feeling playful, shoved Walter toward the middle of the crowd. "Get out there and dance, neighbor, nobody's made of stone." And Walter, the fugitive millionaire, the man locked tight in his grief, the man who'd come here to disappear, danced a square dance in the middle of the whole town, clumsy, laughing, Tommy on one side and Dorothy on the other. At some point in the dance, his eyes met Dorothy's under the orange firelight, and something passed between them that needed no words at all. It wasn't the burning passion of youth. It was something else, deeper, gentler, the recognition of two tired souls that had finally found a harbor. That night, driving home from the celebration, Walter pulled the truck over at an overlook where you could see the whole hollow spread out below, house lights blinking in the dark, the bonfire still glowing on the courthouse lawn. Dorothy sat beside him. They stayed quiet a while, just looking. "You know," Walter finally said, "when I got here, I thought I'd reached the end of everything. End of the road, end of my life, end of me." He paused, searching for the words. But it wasn't an end. It was a beginning. Caroline knew. She sent me to the edge of the map because that's where she'd hidden my new life. Dorothy smiled, eyes shining. She always was the smarter one of the two of us. And the two of them laughed softly under that starry blue ridge sky, two hearts that had each learned, in their own way, that life doesn't end when you think it has. It only rests and starts over. Time passed the way time does, slow and sudden all at once. The apple trees bloomed again, white and fragrant, exactly the way Dorothy had promised, covering the hillsides in a blanket that looked like impossible snow under the summer sun. Walter woke early now, made his cinnamon coffee without spilling a drop, and drank it on the porch watching the sun rise over the ridgeline. He wasn't a man waiting to die anymore. He was a man living his life. The house Caroline had bought in secret no longer smelled of mildew and absence. It smelled of cooking, of flowers in vases Tommy helped water, of life. He'd had the roof fixed, the walls repainted, and in the living room, in a place of honor, hung the photo of Caroline laughing on the beach, right beside an old photograph Dorothy had given him. Two little girls with braids, arms around each other, grinning for a camera 42 years gone. Caroline and Dorothy, aged 12. One Sunday morning, Walter finally did the thing he'd been putting off. He took Caroline's ring, which he'd kept close all those months, and looked at it one last time, held between his fingers. Then, with steady hands, hands that had learned again what to do, he strung a thin chain through the gold band and hung it around his own neck, close to his heart. He wasn't burying Caroline. He was carrying her forward, but in a new way now, a way that held both the longing and the life that kept on going. "Thank you," he told the photo on the wall. "For all of it. For her and for this." And he felt with a certainty too deep to explain that Caroline was smiling. That afternoon he drove up to Sweetwater Farm, as he did almost every day now. Dorothy was on the porch peeling apples, the dog asleep at her feet, chickens scratching in the yard. She looked up when he arrived, and when she saw the chain around his neck with the ring catching the sun, she understood everything without him having to say a word. She smiled that same peaceful smile that had once unsettled Walter, and that now was the most beautiful thing he knew. He sat beside her on the porch bench, picked up an apple to peel alongside her, and the two of them sat there in comfortable silence at the end of that dirt road that had stopped being the end of anything a long time ago. The sun went down orange behind the orchards, the same way it had gone down behind a headstone the day it all began. But there was no ring clenched tight in the fist of a lonely man in front of a grave anymore. There were two hands finding each other slowly, unhurried, on a wooden porch bench under a blue ridge sky. And when his hand finally found hers, fingers lacing together as naturally as if they'd always known each other, Walter looked out at the horizon and understood a truth so simple it had taken him a lifetime to see. The world hadn't changed. It was still full of loss, of storms, of sleepless nights, of people who leave too soon. What had changed was him. He'd come looking for an ending and found a beginning. He'd come to bury a heart, and that heart had started beating again. He'd run from love out of fear of losing it twice. And love had been waiting for him patiently, in the most unlikely place in the world, at the end of a red clay road, in the shape of his late wife's childhood best friend, peeling apples on a porch. Caroline had been right. She was always right. She hadn't left him alone. She'd just changed shape. She became the road, became the house, became cinnamon coffee, became Dorothy. And Walter, who once believed silence would be his only medicine, discovered the real medicine was never silence at all. It was love that keeps going, that changes shape, that starts over, and that even at the end of the road, when we think everything's over, there's still a miracle waiting, if only we're brave enough to keep living long enough to find it. If this story touched your heart, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from tonight. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Tell me which moment hit you hardest. When Walter found Caroline's name carved into that forgotten box, when Dorothy revealed that Caroline herself had bought the farmhouse in secret so he could start over, or when Walter fought through the storm to save someone else's harvest and realized he was still alive. If you believe love doesn't die, that it only changes shape, and that it's never too late to begin again, hit that like button before you go. If you know somebody walking through grief right now, somebody who feels like they've hit the end of the road, share this story with them. It might be exactly the hug they need today. And if you want more stories like this one, stories that restore your faith in people and remind you what's still good in this world, subscribe to the channel and ring that bell so you don't miss the next one. Take care of that heart of yours. It's the most beautiful thing you've got. See you in the next story.